What does it take for a 14-year-old to inflict 114 stab wounds on another child and feel nothing afterward? Not rage, not remorse, not even the biological surge of panic that should follow an act of that scale. Nothing. Pause and consider that for a moment, because most people frame this case as a story about evil, about a monster. But that framing is precisely the trap we are here to avoid. This is not a story about evil. This is a case study in how specific, identifiable psychological traits that exist on a spectrum in the general population, can converge in a developing adolescent brain to produce what a sitting judge would later describe as behavior unlike anything he had seen in his career. What we are going to do today is open the case file, identify the 3 core psychological pillars driving Aiden Fucci's behavior, and, most importantly, teach you how to recognize these patterns before they escalate. Stay with me, because by the end of this analysis, you will never look at certain social behaviors the same way again. Here are the facts relevant to our psychological analysis. In 2021, 14-year-old Aiden Fucci lured 13-year-old Tristan Bailey away from a neighborhood gathering in St. Johns County, Florida. She was stabbed 114 times. The medical examiner confirmed she had attempted to defend herself. There were defensive wounds on her hands. Fucci returned home. He slept. At sentencing in 2023, Judge Arlie Smith delivered an assessment that is forensically significant, not for its emotion, but for its precision. He stated that the crime was not committed out of greed, not out of retaliation, not in passion. There was, he said, simply no reason. He then offered this clinical observation. Fucci's actions were so unusual compared to individuals his age that there was a poor prognosis for any meaningful change. That phrase, poor prognosis for meaningful change, is not just a legal judgment. It is a psychological fingerprint, and it is where our analysis begins. The first psychological pillar we need to examine is narcissistic personality organization, specifically the dark triad variant that manifests not as the loud, preening ego most people picture, but as something far more dangerous: covert grandiosity. Let me explain what that means in practice. Most people assume narcissism looks like arrogance. And sometimes it does. But in adolescent forensic cases, the more lethal form is quieter. It is the internal conviction, unspoken, deeply held, that one exists outside the normal rules of consequence. That other people are props in a private drama. That one's own desires, impulses, and needs are fundamentally more important than the feelings or even the survival of others. In Fucci's case, the behavioral evidence of this trait emerged not during the crime, but after it. Following Tristan Bailey's death, Fucci posted to social media. He used a photo of himself. The caption referenced the investigation. This is not the behavior of someone consumed by guilt or fear. This is the behavior of someone who, at a neurological and psychological level, did not yet conceptualize the event as something that happened to another person. It registered as something that had happened around him, a dramatic event in which he was the central character. This is the grandiosity. Not loud, not boastful, just structurally incapable of decentering the self. Have you ever encountered someone who, in the middle of a crisis that affected others, somehow made it about themselves? Who seemed to be performing their reaction rather than feeling it? That behavioral signature, the performance of affect where genuine affect should be, is one of the earliest observable indicators of narcissistic personality organization in younger individuals. In Fucci's case, this trait did not appear suddenly. Forensic psychologists will tell you, these patterns are always preceded by a developmental history. The grandiosity had a timeline. The crime was simply its most extreme expression. The second pillar is the one most people jump to immediately and consequently understand the least: a lack of empathy. People use this phrase casually. He had no empathy. She lacked empathy. But in forensic psychology, we need to be precise because there are different types of empathy deficits, and the type matters enormously for understanding what happened. There is cognitive empathy, the intellectual ability to model what another person is experiencing. And there is affective empathy, the visceral, embodied feeling of another person's pain as if it were partially your own. Most people with empathy deficits retain cognitive empathy. They understand intellectually that others suffer. They simply do not feel it. This makes them capable of strategic behavior, of understanding consequences, while remaining unmoved by emotional appeals. But in cases involving 114 stab wounds on a 13-year-old who was actively defending her life, we are looking at something more total. The victim's defensive wounds tell us she was communicating, physically and viscerally, that she was suffering. She was bleeding. She was fighting. She was present. For a person with even partial affective empathy, the sensory and emotional information from that encounter would trigger a cascade of biological responses: nausea, panic, overwhelming distress, that would make continuation of the violence almost physically impossible. That cascade did not happen. Pause and consider what that means. This is not someone who suppressed empathy in the heat of the moment. The developmental architecture for affective empathy was insufficient to interrupt the behavior at all. Judge Smith captured this, perhaps without realizing the clinical precision of his words, when he stated that there was simply no reason for the crime. In forensic psychology, when there is no reason, there is often a psychological structure in which other human beings have never fully registered as emotionally real. Think about a time you witnessed someone in pain, a stranger even, and felt something physically uncomfortable in your own body in response. That involuntary response is affective empathy functioning normally. Now imagine that mechanism is simply not there. That is not a moral failing in the conventional sense. It is a developmental and neurological condition. And it is precisely what makes these individuals so difficult to treat and so critical to identify early. Here is where the analysis becomes genuinely complicated. Because when Judge Smith said there was no reason for the crime, he was speaking from the framework of adult social logic. From the perspective of normal human motivation, revenge, greed, passion, he was correct. But absence of social motive does not mean absence of psychological motive. The third pillar is Machiavellian Cognitive Style, a term drawn from the dark triad of personality research. Machiavellianism, in this clinical context, refers to a pattern of strategic, manipulative thinking in which social interactions are primarily processed as problems to be solved in service of the self. Other people are, fundamentally, resources or obstacles. The behavioral evidence here is in the planning. Fucci did not encounter Tristan Bailey by accident that night. He moved with her away from others. The crime did not occur in a moment of impulsive rage. The sheer number of wounds and the continuation of the act suggest a prolonged sequence in which he was making ongoing decisions. This is not consistent with a pure impulse control failure. It is consistent with someone who had, at some level, modeled the situation, identified an opportunity, and proceeded without the internal interruption that empathy, fear of consequences, or social attachment would normally provide. The post-crime social media activity reinforces this reading. He returned home. He slept. He posted. These are the behaviors of someone running an internal model in which the social world could be navigated and managed, not someone overwhelmed by the psychological aftermath of violence. The Machiavellian trait does not explain why he chose this particular act, but it explains the architecture of how the act was possible. Strategic cognitive functioning in the complete absence of emotional restraint. Have you ever encountered someone who seems to be always strategizing, always thinking 3 steps ahead in a conversation, but who, in moments of genuine emotional crisis for others, seems to be running a calculation rather than having a feeling? That pattern, social strategy without emotional engagement, is one of the more reliable behavioral signatures of Machiavellian personality organization. And it rarely announces itself dramatically. It typically presents as someone who is charming, capable, and oddly unmoved. Now we arrive at the part of this case that most coverage ignores, because it is harder to feel outrage about, and outrage is easier to sustain than psychological complexity. What happens to a mind like this inside a life sentence? The sentencing of Aiden Fucci at 16 was not merely a legal event. From a forensic psychology perspective, it functioned as something else entirely. A total severance of the developmental self from the world. The brain does not finish developing until the mid-20s. Every experience, every relationship, every mistake and recovery in those years shapes the neural pathways that will define an adult's personality, their capacity for emotional regulation, their ability to form attachment, their sense of consequence and continuity. Fucci will spend those years in a maximum security correctional facility. Pause and consider what that means architecturally for a mind. The experiences that would normally build, shape, and modulate the very psychological traits we have been analyzing, grandiosity, empathy deficit, Machiavellian cognition, will not occur. Instead, the inputs will be concrete, steel, fluorescent light at 5:30 in the morning, trays of powdered eggs, and the constant ambient presence of violence and domination. These are not neutral inputs. They are, in many respects, precisely calibrated, though not intentionally, to reinforce the psychological traits that led to the crime. Hypervigilance, emotional suppression, strategic social navigation, the devaluation of other human beings as a survival mechanism. The final room of this case is not a physical chamber. It is the psychological terminus of a developmental trajectory that was never adequately interrupted. No graduation ceremony. No first relationship built on genuine vulnerability. No moment of watching another person suffer and feeling it in the body and making a different choice. Just decades of identical days. A mind that is still forming, being shaped by the architecture of punishment. What the state has done, from a purely clinical perspective, is freeze the conditions that created the problem and call it justice. That is not a moral argument for leniency. It is a clinical observation about what life sentences for juveniles actually produce inside a developing human brain. The witnesses on the other side of the glass will watch a sentence be carried out. What none of them will see is the cognitive and emotional severance happening in real time, the final foreclosure of the person he might have become. So what do you do with this? Because the purpose of forensic psychology is not to generate horror. It is to generate pattern recognition. The three pillars we examine today, narcissistic grandiosity, affective empathy deficit, and Machiavellian cognitive style, do not appear fully formed in a 14-year-old. They have developmental histories. They leave behavioral traces long before they reach their catastrophic expression. Here is what to watch for in everyday life. The first signal is a consistent inability to decenter. In conversation, in conflict, in crisis, the person repeatedly redirects the focus to their own experience, not as a momentary habit, but as a structural default. They are not self-absorbed in the way most people occasionally are. They are structurally incapable of sustained attention to another person's inner life. The second signal is the performed emotional response. Grief, shock, concern, remorse. These are present, but they have a quality of being slightly off-tempo, slightly wrong. Like someone who has learned what these emotions are supposed to look like and is executing the behavior, but is not generating it from the inside. Trust that instinct when you feel it. It is your affective empathy reading the absence of theirs. The third signal is the manipulation without apparent motive. When someone consistently maneuvers people and situations in ways that serve their interests and does so without apparent enjoyment or obvious agenda, just as a mode of operating in the world, you are likely observing Machiavellian cognitive style. None of these signals, individually, predicts violence. The overwhelming majority of people with dark triad traits never commit crimes. But in combination, in the absence of protective factors, attachment, intervention, community, consequence, they form a profile that forensic psychologists recognize across case file after case file. Tristan Bailey deserved to be protected by a world that could recognize that profile before the night of May 8, 2021. Our work is to build that world. This has been a forensic psychology analysis. If you found this examination useful, engage with it, not because the algorithm rewards it, but because cases like this deserve to be understood rather than only mourned. The next case is already waiting.